Good evening and welcome to our Behind the Headlines on climate change and pandemics on our virtual campus in Trinity College, Dublin. To those who are joining us on Zoom, welcome to our virtual lecture theatre. And those on Facebook, we're absolutely delighted that you can join us through our live stream. My name is Jane Ohlmeyer. I am the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is our research institute in the arts and humanities. It's a very special year for us because we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. And I think it's an anniversary that will live with us for a very long time. We do three things in the Trinity Long Room Hub. The first thing we do is promote the excellence of the arts and humanities at Trinity. The second thing we do is drive innovative approaches to research, and particularly we promote interdisciplinarity. In other words, we really want to encourage disciplines to have conversations with each other, because when the disciplines collide, the magic happens. And I think we're going to have a fabulous example of that here this evening. The third thing that we do in the Trinity Long Room Hub is we promote public humanities. And again, I hope this evening is an excellent example of this. Our Behind the Headlines discussion series, really we aim to contribute to understanding of current issues in the media. We want to deepen understanding and combat simplification and polarization. So a big thank you to everybody who makes public humanities in the Hub happen, to Terry Neal. And I'm also extremely grateful to Stephen Vernon and the John Pollard Foundation who support Behind the Headlines. As the world continues to grapple with the crisis created by COVID-19, our distinguished panel will this evening look at climate change and pandemics. By way of introduction, I want to quote from Fintan O'Toole's piece in Saturday's Irish Times. Most of us can't see the coronavirus, but we can see its effects. Unnervingly, we can see how, from the point of view of planet Earth, it makes things better. For us human beings, it is devastating, emotionally, socially, and economically. But for the planet, it is a holiday from our otherwise relentless foulness. COVID-19 has changed how we live. Will it force us to rethink climate change? This is the question we are asking you tonight in our poll. It should appear now on your screen, and we would really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind answering it. It'll appear for anybody who's in Zoom. Sadly, on Facebook, you won't see it, but the question is, has the COVID-19 pandemic made you rethink the response needed for climate change? So you can either say yes, no, or unsure. We'll return to our poll at the end of our presentations. Tonight, as per our last discussion on plagues and pandemics, we're doing it virtually. We're not physically in Trinity. We're all joining you from home. I'm here in Northwest Donegal, where the Wi-Fi can be highly problematic. So fingers crossed tonight we don't have any technical issues. Our fellow panelists are joining us from elsewhere in Ireland, and one is coming all the way from the United States. Catherine's joining us from Texas. So again, fingers crossed that the technology behaves itself tonight. And if things go wrong, we'll keep on going, so nobody should worry about it anyway. The format, though, is as if we were in the Edmund Burke in Dublin. Each speaker will talk for 9 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions and then a discussion. We invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll read them out at the end. Please, when you ask a question, say something about yourself. Tell us very briefly who you are and where you are in the world. Those listening on Facebook can also write a question in the comments section, and we'll monitor these and try and take as many questions as time allows. Social media, we would love everybody to tweet tonight using the handle TLR Hub, TLR Hub, and the hashtag Hub Matters. Okay, to our fabulous panelists. I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll speak. So I'd like to start with Catherine Hayhoe, who is an atmospheric scientist and director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. She is a remarkable communicator who has been named to a number of lists, including the Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People and Fortune magazine's World's Greatest Leaders. She has served as the lead author on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th National Climate Assessments. Now, Catherine actually was in Dublin very recently, and she was due to speak in Trinity on the 12th of March, which was, of course, the day that we learned about the lockdown. So she came all the way to Ireland and then went all the way back to the United States. So Catherine, it really is a pleasure to have you here with us this evening for some unfinished business. Our second speaker tonight is Michael Cronin. Michael is the Professor of French at Trinity and Director of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation. Michael's a hugely distinguished scholar and is the author of Eco-Translation, Translation and Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene. That was 2017. And then another book, most recently, Irish and Ecology. So Michael, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Our third speaker is Jane Stout. She's Professor of Botany in Trinity and has the chair and is chair of the Natural Capital Ireland. Sorry, Jane. She explores the relationships between plants, animals, and people, and focuses on pollination, ecology, exploring how interactions shape ecological processes at individual, community, and ecosystem scales. Jane is also our bee lady. We all know and love Jane's work with bees, and it's great that you could be with us this evening, Jane. Our final speaker this evening is Dara Mcculla. Dara is a farmer, a journalist, and a broadcaster. He has presented RTE's flagship farming programme, Ear to the Ground, for 17 years and writes a weekly column in the Irish Independent. He manages a 120 hectare mixed farm in County Meath, where he employs up to 40 staff and normally, and I say normally, supplies flowers and bulbs to supermarkets and export markets around the world. Obviously, extraordinarily challenging times, Dara, and we'll come back to that with your presentation. But without further ado, I'd like to turn to Catherine Hayhoe, who will kick off our proceedings this evening. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. I was also reflecting on what the world looked like 4 weeks ago. So just 4 weeks ago today, I was in Galway. I was giving a lecture on how we have tough conversations about climate change at NUIG. I was preparing to head over to Trinity, where you were going to be hosting this event on Thursday evening. And then within just a few days, the world changed. Today, universities are shuttered, bars are closed, the St. Patrick's Day celebrations were all canceled. When we turn on the news, we hear about suffering around the world, about physical suffering, about economic suffering, about all of the suffering that this pandemic brings with it. So many people might be wondering, why are we having a conversation about climate change when all we can think about is our current pandemic? There's a few reasons, I think, and I look forward to hearing the reasons others share as well. But it's because there are connections. There are intimate connections between the pandemic, our response, and the risks and solutions to a changing climate. So, for example, we hear in the news that our carbon emissions have dropped as a result. And some may feel, well, isn't that good news for climate change? But oil prices have also dropped. And the industrial slowdown has affected renewable energy technology too. We also hear that air pollution has dropped in many urban centers around the world. But a brand new study that just came out today from Harvard University found that actually air pollution that we've already been exposed to is significantly increasing our illness and death rates associated with the pandemic. What we have learned, I feel, is this, that we all live in an interconnected world. The pandemic has showed us that no matter where we live, no matter what language we speak, no matter who we are, today we are all living the same life. We are practicing physical distancing. We are trying to connect socially with our friends and family and loved ones and colleagues in more and more creative ways. And more than ever, we recognize that we are all part of this same world together. And that's exactly how climate change affects us too. When it comes to a climate change, the biggest myth that the largest number of us believe in is not the myth we hear about so frequently in the news, the idea that the science is somehow just a matter of opinion. No, it's what we call psychological distance. It's the myth that it doesn't matter to me. It only matters to future generations or to people who live far away or to things that aren't important to me. But think back 4 weeks. We were feeling the same way about coronavirus. It only matters maybe to people in the future, but not to us today. It matters to people who live over here, but not people right now. It might matter to people who care about certain things, but not what I care about. Today, we know that the pandemic does matter to each one of us, and climate change matters too. It is here and it is now. When I was in Ireland, the country had just received the wettest February on record. 16 of the 25 long-term weather stations around Ireland recorded the wettest February ever. We see that heavy rainfall is already becoming more frequent and more intense across Ireland. Unfortunately, the flip side is we see that as it gets warmer, we have stronger and more frequent heat waves in the summer and more frequent and stronger droughts as well. And then, of course, there's sea level rise, which is threatening coastal cities. And most of the major cities in Ireland are coastal. With climate change, it's as if we are where we were at with the pandemic 4 weeks ago. Climate change, of course, operates over a much longer scale, which means we still have time to act to avoid the worst. Not all, but the worst of the impacts. But swift action is needed. And even though it plays out over years to decades, rather than hours to days, as we see with the pandemic, the risk posed by climate change is just as great, if not much greater. It is not about preserving our planet. The planet will still orbit the sun long after we're gone. It is about preserving the health and the welfare of every living thing on this planet, including ourselves. And that brings me to the second biggest myth we believe. The first, that it doesn't matter to me. And the second is that we can't fix it, or that the only solutions to fix it are worse than the impacts, that the cure is worse than the disease. So for example, in Ireland, we focus on, well, how will farmers cope with the need to reduce methane emissions from cows? But at the same time, farmers are suffering tremendous losses, from floods and rain that keep them from getting into their fields to extreme droughts in the summer that lead to devastation and crop losses. Interestingly, a survey just last year of the whole EU, every country in the EU, showed that Ireland was in the bottom third of all countries on the awareness of the need to reduce emissions. But here's the interesting thing. Ireland was consistently in the top 3, 1, 2, 3 of countries in the whole EU when they were asked, are you willing to make changes? And are you willing to do more? So the reality is that there are solutions, from feeding cows seaweed and probiotics to improve their digestion and decrease their methane emissions, to looking forward into the future and preparing for heavier rains, stronger droughts. With climate change, we are rapidly nearing the point that we were at when we took decisive action on the pandemic. But with climate change, by the time disaster hits, it is too late. That is why we need to act now. And this is the final lesson that I believe the coronavirus pandemic has taught us. That when it all comes down to it, what matters to every single one of us is the same, no matter who we are and where we live. It is the health and the safety of our family, our loved ones, our friends, our community, the people and places we care about. That's what the pandemic puts at risk, and that is exactly what climate change puts at risk as well.
Thank you very, very much, Catherine. Michael.
Change. I was thinking about a number of arguments, but then what occurred to me when the pandemic suddenly turned up in the way that it did was, what was the connection? What was the kind of link between these two events? And one link that stood out for me more than anything else, if you like, was the relationship between the human and the non-human. Because one of the things about COVID-19 is that COVID-19 is the best known organism on the planet. It's not Michael Cronin, it's not Jane Ohlmeyer, it's not Jane Stout, it's not Boris Johnson, it's not Donald Trump. The most important, most widely known organism on the planet is COVID-19. So one of the things that, if you like, this is kind of forced into our vision is the material agency of the non-human. In other words, the extent to which the non-human is this increasing overwhelming presence in our lives. One of the things, of course, that has happened as a result, a mixture of kind of science and Christianity with the notion that we're given kind of dominion over all of the animals, that humans had a soul, animals in the natural world didn't, or in the Cartesian view that humans were the masters and possessors of nature, and what the science did was it became the kind of the insult of that domination. Kind of the convergence of these two things meant that the human was put very much at the center of the universe. I work in an area that is described as the humanities. It's not described as the non-humanities. So one of the things I think that is happening with COVID-19 is that it's very much bringing the non-human back into view. The non-human, the agency of the non-human, which is so important in climate change, but it's also something that's hugely important, obviously, in the case of the pandemic. I think there are kind of three consequences of this. One is what I'm going to call the looking in, the other is looking out, and the third is looking up. So looking in, if we look at the history of the 19th and the 20th century, they were very much what I would call the revolutions of externalization. This was basically, you built the railways, you constructed the airplanes, you built the airports, you built the bridges. The whole thing was, how did you globalize commerce? How do you globalize trade? How do you globalize the exchange of human beings? How do you bring, if you like, places that are very distant, closer and closer together? So all of our ingenuity, all of our investment, all of our thinking was very much focused on that. The revolutionary challenge, it seems to me, of the 21st century, and we can see this immediately with the consequences of COVID-19, is what I would call the revolution of internalization. In other words, how do we make our local environments, the environments that surround us, environments that are sustainable, environments that are resilient, environments that carry us into the future? And how do we, in those environments, if you like, negotiate the relationship with the human and the non-human? So the kind of resources, the kind of intelligence and ingenuity that has driven the revolution of externalization for 2 centuries is now the kind of thing we're going to have to think about in our century. So this is very much what I would call the looking in. The looking out is to do with the role of culture. I often think to kind of reformulate that famous kind of catchphrase from the Clinton era, it's the economy stupid. I often think that what I want to say, it's culture stupid. And what I mean by this is that one of the extraordinary kind of resources that humans have in all kinds of different cultures, in terms of understanding where they stand in the world, how they kind of get themselves away from forms of human exceptionalism, kind of human hubris, human excessive pride, are the stories they tell, the languages they use, the songs that they sing. If we think of kind of one of the founding myths of the island of Ireland, where we have one of our legendary ancestors, Argin Glúngeal, who says, I am the wind on the sea, I am the wave of the sea, I am the eagle of the rock, I'm the flash from the sun. All of those are non-human metaphors to describe these Irish songlines that kind of sing the Irish landscape into being. And of course, one of the things that that's very striking about early Irish Christianity is the extent to which there's this profound engagement with the natural world. The natural world as material agency. It is an active, dynamic presence in the lives of the people who write about it and describe it. You see this beautifully in the collection called the Early Irish Lyrics from Gerald Murphy. Columbanus, who's often seen as the founder of the European idea, the first person to use the phrase "we Europeans" in a letter. It's famously reported that he had this exceptional kind of relationship with the non-human, to the extent that everywhere he went, he was surrounded and followed by a flock of wild geese, which is probably a good description, the best one I can think of political advisors in the contemporary era. But what it does show is that kind of relationship that existed in Irish culture between these two parts of our world. One of the points that Robert Macfarlane, the British nature writer, makes is that what begins with aesthetics ends in ethics. In other words, that the more we pay attention to something, the less likely we are to care about it. So the more we pay attention to in our language, in our song, in our stories, to the world around us and the things that inhabit us, then you begin to, if you like, see that world differently, you see it anew, and you begin to see it as something valuable. And one of the extraordinary things, if we think of our writers like Seamus Heaney, Moya Cannon, Nuala O'Connell, the late, great Tim Robinson, what they do when they talk about the landscape is that they begin with aesthetics, but they always end in ethics. It's always a kind of a summons, if you like, to care about the landscapes that we inhabit, the world of which we are a part. So this is very much, for me, the kind of the looking out that's involved through cultural mediation of the world. And finally, there's what I would call the looking up. Timothy Morton, in a recent book called Being Ecological, says, at present, the ways in which we talk to ourselves about ecology are stuck in the horror mode: disgust, shame, and guilt. Right? In other words, one of the most disabling, one of the most crippling ways we have of talking about ecology is using the language of guilt. And there's nothing, if you like, more disabling, more paralyzing than guilt. So it seems to me that one of the things, by looking more attentively to the world, by the re-enchantment of the world through cultural observation, cultural attentiveness, is that we begin to invent new pleasures rather than spend our times being seen as kind of policing pleasures that people have in their everyday lives. And one of the things, of course, that this does is that it famously, this kind of looking up that comes from the looking in and the looking out, is that we begin to rediscover the extraordinary pleasures of our everyday life, the world that surrounds us, that COVID, in all of our confinement, if you like, has, in a curious way, made us measure even more intensely the value of and how it's important to our sense of a shared and collective future. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Again, very powerful words from you. Can we turn now, please, Jane, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I want to talk to you this evening about nature. And nature isn't a luxury. It is our life support system. It's fascinating, it's wondrous, and it provides us with sustenance, with shelter, with protection against the elements, protection against natural hazards. Nature isn't just a nice to have, it's a must have every day. And not just in the good times, but in times of crisis like now as well. So I'm an ecologist, and this means that I study and try to understand the complexity of nature. So the interactions between organisms and the physical environment that they live in, and how organisms and their interactions respond to big changes, global changes, and how that ultimately affects us, our own health and well-being. And the interactions that we see in nature aren't always positive from a human viewpoint. It was Tennyson in 1850 who first talked about nature red in tooth and claw, referring to the apparent violence, ruthlessness, and tragedy that's common in interactions among organisms in nature. And as an ecologist, I learned back in my undergraduate days that the populations of organisms, whether they be plants, animals, from the biggest mammals to the smallest insects, are naturally regulated. Populations don't just keep growing more and more with more and more individuals. They hit a ceiling where they're limited by resources like space or food, or by predators, or by disease. And we learned that disease is part of nature. And as an ecologist, I also appreciate that diversity in nature makes ecosystems resilient in the face of disturbance. And this is equally true for humanity. Diversity in nature enables us as a species to cope with perturbation and change. And this includes the extreme climate events like fires, floods, droughts, and like disease. Diversity of nature means that we can bounce back. So, for example, research has shown that high biodiversity reduces the risk of animal vectored diseases in human populations. For example, in mosquito and tick-borne diseases, where there's a high diversity of wild animals, wild vertebrates in a particular area, the mosquitoes and the ticks feed on them instead of on us, and they feed on this diversity of hosts, most of which are actually poor reservoirs for the pathogens, and this results in lower infection rates in humans. So diversity makes us less likely to be infected. But we can't take nature for granted. Nature is in trouble, and when it's in trouble, so are we. This time last year, a landmark report on nature was published. It was a global assessment of biodiversity, equivalent to the IPCC reports for climate, and it made for pretty depressing reading. 3/4 of Earth's land surface and 2/3 of the marine significantly altered by human activity, habitats destroyed and degraded, and 1 million species at risk of extinction. And the report used words like alarming and crisis, and scientists don't often use these kind of words, but these words were used to try and communicate to the world that this really is a big deal, and to get people to realize that we don't just have a climate crisis, but we have a biodiversity crisis too. And the two aren't only linked with each other, but they're both linked with humanity's health and well-being. And people are starting to get it. The World Economic Forum this year recognized that climate change and biodiversity loss are some of the biggest risks with the greatest potential impacts on world economies. And they also recognized infectious disease as a top 10 risk. And the increasing frequency of disease outbreaks is linked with both climate change and biodiversity loss, even though other things have contributed to the rise in disease outbreaks like global travel, trade, high density urban living, the links to climate change and biodiversity and disease outbreaks are the most striking. So climate change altered and accelerated transmission patterns of diseases like Zika and malaria, caused displacement of humans, and the movement of large groups of people to new areas means that they're more vulnerable to disease. And the destruction of nature, deforestation, removal of habitat has brought humans and wild animals into closer contact. And that's when zoonotic diseases get into humans. So zoonotic diseases are those that can be transmitted from other animals into humans, or those that normally exist in other animals but can infect humans, like this novel coronavirus. So as deforestation has increased over the past 20 years, we've seen increases in diseases like Ebola and Zika. So when natural habitats are destroyed, or when particular species are traded and handled by people, the risk for disease spread from wild animals to humans increases, and these novel diseases appear in humans. And the bottom line is that if we continue to destroy nature, we destroy our life support system and our ability to cope with what nature throws back at us. So what can we do and what can we learn from the COVID pandemic? As part of the global assessment of biodiversity that I mentioned published this time last year, a range of policy scenarios were tested to address the negative trends in nature. But the report concluded that these negative trends will all continue to 2050 under all of the policy scenarios, except a scenario of transformative change. And the report concluded that the world needs transformative change to address both biodiversity and climate crises. And this transformative change includes stronger international cooperation, correcting perverse incentive structures like incentivizing destruction of nature or extraction of fossil fuel for profit, applying more holistic approaches to decision making, so not making decisions, blinkered decisions in silos, and strengthening implementation of laws and policies for improved human health and well-being. So this is what transformative change looks like. And you could say that this pandemic has created a transformative change, unplanned, but transformative all the same. And this year, 2020, was supposed to be a super year for nature and biodiversity, with global conventions for climate and biodiversity, making the targets that will lead us into the coming decades and centuries. And the decisions that we make now about climate and biodiversity could potentially affect the future of humanity. We are at the point beyond which we won't be able to make the necessary changes. But then at the start of 2020, the new coronavirus appeared in China. And since then, we've all become painfully aware of how humanity is not immune to nature. So what has the current pandemic taught us? I think firstly, it's shown us that society can change. And the way that we live and work can change. People don't have to be traveling all the time. There's more remote working. There's more connection with nature in our free time. But it's also shown us that we don't have the infrastructure to cope when we want to use or enjoy nature. We've all seen national parks and urban green spaces quickly becoming overcrowded. So we need investment in nature, both for the sake of nature and what it's giving to us, and for ourselves and our own physical and mental well-being. Secondly, I think it's shown us that governments can implement socially unpopular policies in the interest of public good and to the detriment of the economy. I mean, the speed at which everything has changed to protect human health has been remarkable. It's shown that we can respond to a crisis when we need to. And climate change and biodiversity loss are global crises that are also threatening human health. We know they're happening, and they also need urgent action. And we haven't seen this urgent action happen yet. And perhaps this is because it's a case with the current closures and social restrictions that we're all looking towards a time when it's over, when we can go back to normal. Whereas with biodiversity loss and climate change, we actually need to make long-term changes. And the idea of long-term changes is more overwhelming to us. But after this pandemic is over, we will have to rebuild ourselves as a species, our societies, our economy, and we have the opportunity to do that in a new way where nature and the benefits that it provides for humanity aren't ignored, where fossil fuels are left in the ground so we have a chance to respond to the climate crisis while we still can. We need to change our behaviour to tackle the biodiversity and climate crisis, to ensure that food, resources, employment and health are all provided in a sustainable way. So finally, this pandemic may actually help us see what we need to do. We have the ability to respond to a crisis. We've seen incredible sacrifices made by many to save human lives. We've seen families, communities, and societies coming together. Let's build on that strength for a better future for nature and for people.
Thank you very, very much, Jane. Last but not least, Dara, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to join this event. I must admit that this evening was the first evening I really had a chance to sit down and think about COVID-19 and what it means in terms of climate change, because for the last week, we've basically been in a kind of a maelstrom here on the farm at home, last 2 weeks really. 2 weeks ago, the lockdown began in earnest, and we were in the midst of our main harvest on the farm at home, which is daffodil harvesting. And all of a sudden, a lot of my workforce decided that they may need to go back home in a hurry because I depend entirely on Romanians to pick daffodils, because no Irish people, even in the midst of the last recession, ever volunteered to pick daffodils in my fields. I suppose that's just one little indication of what a globalized society we live in now. So half of my workforce was threatening to leave, and half of my markets were threatening to evaporate. So again, my daffodils twice a week are loaded onto trucks, and they head to Holland, from where they head to Poland, they head basically all over Europe, and indeed all over the world. And the first I knew that there was a serious problem, i.e., I was facing a potential loss of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of euro, because remember, the first 3 months of the year is the crucial harvest time for my farm, was when I saw the news clip with 20 million euros of flowers being dumped daily in Holland on the Dutch flower market. So literally overnight, buyers were cancelling contracts, and it looked like I could be in dire straits. Happily, it hasn't turned out that way. I got the last of my flowers pretty much away. We were left with some, and I, in a moment of either inspiration or madness, about a week ago decided to post online that I would deliver bouquets of flowers anywhere in the country for €20 to try and get rid of all these lovely tulips and other flowers that I come in my tunnels, because of course Mother Nature was getting out of her bed and getting into gear, and you can't turn off the tap even despite what COVID-19 might be doing. For the next, ever since basically, the phone has not stopped binging and dinging and ringing with tweets and messages and emails, which is great. We got a huge response, but I was only after posting that I realized, hang on a second, I've never taken a credit card payment across the phone. I don't know how to do electronic payments. I don't have a website. I don't have a web shop. Oh my God, how do we make this work? So every morning since, I've been up at 4 or 4:30 and worked until about now every night until I fall into bed and get up and do it again the next morning, in an effort to try and re-engineer the business to try and cope with this new norm. So all my local flower outlets had evaporated, and I tried to reinvent the business. And I think, you know, it's been an incredibly stressful period. I had to try and figure out Stripe payments and web design and CSV files and all this stuff that farmers don't need to know about 99.9% of the time. We're getting there, but it kind of brought home to me that a lot of people talk about, well, you know, farmers, why don't they try this, or why don't they, you know, change what they've always been doing and, you know, try a new way? It's not very simple. It's not easy. And I would consider myself reasonably IT literate, reasonably savvy on social media, reasonably kind of plugged into what the consumer wants. Most farmers don't have the luxury of swanning around the country like I do, interviewing other farmers and seeing how other businesses work. So I think it would be a huge ask for most farmers to do what we've done in the last week. That's how how COVID-19 impacted on my farm. I think COVID-19, in a kind of ironic twist, a lot of farms are the most normal places on the planet right now because they're doing what they've always done. They're planting crops after 6 months of incessant rain. So suddenly the fields are humming with tractors and activity. Cows still are calving, cows still need to be milked. So farmers are basically continuing on with the same routines that they've always done, while the rest of the country and the rest of the economy goes into hibernation, all but the essential services. But that doesn't mean that farmers aren't very anxious about this whole period. So they're obviously anxious about their own health and their families, but they're also anxious about their markets. And again, I come back to that interconnectedness of the global world that we now live in. So, you know, my staff were threatening to evaporate overnight. Thankfully, they didn't. But then I get a call from my neighbor, who's a strawberry farmer, saying, listen, will you make sure that you send your staff up the road to me, because all the Polish guys that I normally rely on can't get flights over to pick the crop. And that's happening, playing out all over the world actually now, that the migrant labor that harvests all the food that we consume and that 99.9% of the people watching this and listening into this have never touched, 99% of the labor can't get to where the food needs to be harvested now, or won't get to it. That's the supply. The demand has also fallen off a cliff and kind of gone all weird. So supermarkets are selling maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times what they normally sell, and the service sector has collapsed. So food chains and supply chains are all in a heap. There's lots of boats parked outside ports in China waiting to get in. They're waiting to offload. They can't get back across the world to reload until they offload. that's why the dairy industry here is very nervous that their stores are filling up and they can't empty those stores to get the product to the markets that they rely on. And bear in mind that 90% of the food produced in Ireland is exported off these shores. 90% of all the litres of milk, all the kilos of beef, all the pork, all the lamb goes outside of Ireland. So if we can't shift it, we have a major problem. So Irish farmers are nervous. The prices are coming down. They don't know what is ahead of them, but they have to keep on getting up every morning and keep milking the cows and keep feeding their stock because they can't do anything else. What does COVID-19 mean for Irish agriculture or international agriculture? I'm not sure that it's going to change a lot in terms of climate change. What I've been amazed by is how resilient Donald Trump's ratings have been throughout this whole crisis. He's ignored all the advice, and yet he's still riding high in the polls. So if people are still willing to believe what Donald Trump says now, I don't think they're going to change their minds about what he says about climate change. So I think you've got that whole cohort of the Earth's population who are going to go on blithely regardless, and they're just waiting to get back to normal, right? I think in Ireland, most farmers can't do anything that they're not already doing in terms of coping with this current crisis. But I think there's a lot happening behind the scenes in terms of what they're trying to do to prepare for a climate crisis. And I'm one of those crazy optimists that thinks that Irish agriculture can be carbon neutral. I mean, that is next to kind of, claiming that the earth is flat in some circles, because, the idea that a Irish agriculture sector that is so dependent on ruminants, which belch and fart and let out all this methane into the sky. And again, I come back to one of the earlier speakers' points about how Irish people didn't seem to be aware of the impact of methane on the environment. I was surprised to hear that, because one of the things that struck me during this whole COVID crisis was how well Irish people were able to understand the information that was coming at them about how to deal with what was the reality on the ground in terms of the COVID-19 situation, compared to a lot of other countries around the world. So I think the Irish public are quite literate in terms of science and in terms of facts. So I would be relatively optimistic that they get it as much as any other country in the world. And I think Irish farmers get it. What they are upset about is being labelled as environmental terrorists. And, once this is all over, we'll go back to having long conversations about things like just transitions, which of course is totally being shoved to one side at the moment. But, I do feel that the idea and the theory of just transition isn't playing out for huge swathes of rural Ireland. So when you go down to the Midlands and you find that people are looking at their way of life in the peat industry being shut down at the end of this year, that is not a just transition. And they are rightly upset. And when I wrote about this, and I'm going to finish on this point, because I think this is where the other speakers, this comes back to the other speakers in this event. When I wrote about the anger that communities in the Midlands felt about being left behind, about that they weren't really being taken along in a just transition, that they were being steamrolled effectively, I got criticised on social media by environmentalists who went after me because I had talked about Bord na Móna's efforts to, harvest sap from birch trees, which were quote unquote growing like weeds on the bogs. And how dare I refer to birch trees growing like weeds? And, Dara, stop trying to commodify everything in nature. I just felt that was a classic example of environmentalists and academics entirely missing the point. This was a whole community, is a whole community, a whole swathe of our population who feel like they're facing annihilation in climate change. And if we don't reach out and put our arms around them, they are going to turn to other leadership for answers and for support. And I think that's where you get this really dangerous polarization in public and in opinion, where two sides cannot communicate, cannot get on the same side of the page. So yeah, I feel that that's where conversations like this, where people can come from very different perspectives and still, you know, find common ground. We've got to cherish those conversations any way we can. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Dara. I mean, that is exactly what Behind the Headlines is all about. So what a nice way of ending off your presentation. We've had 4 absolutely fabulous contributions. Before we move to Q&A, and if I could just remind the audience to use the Q&A function. So if you're in the Zoom room, it's at the bottom of your screen. We'll also try and collect questions from Facebook. I have a whole raft of them that have already flooded in. But before we do that, I'd like to go to the result of our poll. I don't know if somebody can put the poll result up for us. Francesca, do you have it there? Maybe not. Well, clearly not. I'm just curious to see what that was. All right, hopefully we'll bring the poll to you in a minute. Let's get, oh, is it coming in?
The results are there and they should be visible to the audience. And if you can't see it, it's saying at the moment, yes for 66%, no for 22%, and unsure for 12%.
So Francesca, the sound is very poor. Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, we have yes, 66%, no.
So just read the question again.
Has the COVID-19 pandemic made you rethink the response needed for climate change? Yes for 66%, 22% said no, and 12% said unsure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's fascinating. Okay, let's go to our questions. I'm going to start with one from Sylvia Thompson, and her question is, what lessons need to be learned right now about the spread of infectious diseases from wild animals to humans? There's a related one from Tony Brogan, who describes himself as an independent researcher, and his question is, do we need a Paris Agreement for infectious diseases? So sort of related there. Jane, can we start with you and then move to the rest of the panel? Would you mind tackling that one?
Yeah, sure. I was kind of hoping you wouldn't come to me on that one. Not being an expert in infectious diseases and infectious disease spread. I mean, my understanding of this particular, the way that this disease spread into humans in this case, it seems to be that it was through the wet market in Wuhan, where there was trade in animals where they have detected a virus most closely related to the one that is infecting people at the moment. So I don't think the transmission routes are fully understood, but as I say, I'm not an expert in this area. I think from an ecological point of view, it's not surprising that there has been this transmission. You know, the trade in wild animals and animals taken from the wild, they carry lots of different diseases, some of which we can contract, some of which they just carry but don't show any symptoms of. You know, as we trade in wild animals and as we destroy wild animal habitat, the chances of those diseases getting into the human population are increased. So whether we need a big convention on this, I don't think I'm the right person to comment on that. But I think, you know, it's the bringing humanity and nature into this very close proximity in a bad way. You know, I think humanity and nature, you know, we go hand in hand, and most of the times that's a good thing. It's when it happens under these stressful circumstances that I think you get these adverse reactions. But I'd be interested to hear if anyone else would. I don't
know if anybody else would like to come in there. Catherine?
Yes. So I would say, first of all, I completely agree with what Jane said. And I would also emphasize this, though, that the spread of infectious diseases is a symptom. It's not the cause. The cause is twofold. First of all, in terms of infectious diseases that spread from animal populations to human populations, as is believed to have happened with the coronavirus. The genome of coronavirus in bats is about 96% identical to that in humans. So they believe it was transmitted through an intermediary animal such as a pangolin to human populations. So with that, the issue is that our wildlife habitat is becoming increasingly constricted and pressed. As habitat destruction and fragmentation occurs, as climate change related droughts and shifts in habitat occur, as wildlife trafficking occurs, more and more animal populations are being brought into contact with humans, and that facilitates that process by which disease jumps from animal to human populations and is then spread by humans, which is the case happening now with the pandemic. There's a second type of infectious diseases, though, that are primarily related to climate change. And these are the diseases actually that Jane referred to earlier that are carried by what we call vectors, by ticks, by mosquitoes, by animals whose range expands poleward as climate warms. So just to give you an example, I am from Ontario in Canada. I grew up running through the woods every summer, and we had plenty of mosquitoes, but they didn't carry any diseases, and we never saw a tick. On the other hand, my husband grew up in rural Virginia. He spent every summer running through the woods and being picked over by his mother for ticks every night because they had ticks everywhere, and ticks carry Lyme disease now. But today, all through where I grew up, we have ticks, we have Lyme disease, because as our winters warm, these carriers of disease are spreading northward. We see this happening for dengue, for chikungunya, for Zika, for things that are carried specifically by vectors. They're affected by climate change. So we need the Paris Agreement, absolutely. We also need a similar commitment to preserve the wild spaces on this planet, because we are all part of this functioning ecosystem. And when one part of us suffers, we all suffer.
We'll move on unless Michael or Dara want to come in here. Maybe, do you want to come in? I have a question for you as well, Michael, but please start and then I'll ask you the question that's come up, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking part of the answer to the question lies in the area of the kind of cultural education or cultural formation of people. Because what's very, very striking, for example, in children's literature, we find animal creatures appearing everywhere. They're kind of, if you think of animated films, if you think of the books that children are reading, often kind of Disney characters, Winnie the Pooh and so on, the co-presence of human animals is something that is everywhere. But then there's a strange kind of thing that happens, is that once people move to what's referred to as kind of fiction for grown-ups, for adults, and so on, is that the animals disappear, that kind of co-presence with the other creatures on the planet, with the non-humans, suddenly kind of disappears to kind of a vanishing point. And the only thing that kind of rescues this is, the occasional documentary by David Attenborough and others who are doing this kind of admirable work. But it's this strange kind of void. And it seems to me that one of the consequences of that void is a lack of respect, a lack of understanding for the organisms we share the planet, that lead to some of the consequences that the other speakers have described. So it seems to me there's a kind of cultural component to it as a part, alongside a duty of scientific and civic care.
Michael, that brings us very nicely actually to this next question, which is from Jennifer in Dublin. And it says, do you think the inheritances of arts and culture from the past have also played a part in contributing to contemporary biodiversity and climate crises?
I think it has, for good and for ill. I think, for example, if we look at the specific case of Ireland, one of the ways in which we had kind of cultural dysfunction, which I think led to a lot of the difficulties that we had around environmental awareness, was language shift in the 19th century. I think one of the things that we tend not to talk enough about is the very quite dramatic shift from one language to another that occurred in Ireland in the 19th century. 2/3 of the population basically kind of functioning Gaelic speakers. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, the census returned that about 2.7% who were speakers of Irish Gaelic. But one of the consequences of language shift and language change is that people lost the language to describe the world in which they inhabited. The words that they had for insects, the words they had for flowers, the words they had for birds, the words they had for trees, all of that became a kind of a blank. And it had to be kind of relearned all over again. And I think one of the consequences of that is that it led to the development of what I would call a culture of possession rather than a culture of dwelling. That it became difficult to dwell knowingly in a place that suddenly had become kind of blind to you. And this, Brian Freeland's play Translations talks a great deal about this. So this, I think, is the kind of the difficult inheritance culturally. In terms of a more positive inheritance, I think that, you know, something that you find right from those early Irish lyrics that are ascribed to Renaissance poetry in English in Ireland, to a plethora of tunes in the Irish musical tradition that talk about, describe, that try to mimic or imitate nature and natural process in various ways. That these were things that were bringing people closer to that world, and that's why I suppose I see it as a resource. But unless it seems we think knowingly and consciously about the cultural frame to a lot of our debates, I think what we can disappear kind of down kind of positivist manholes where the larger picture sometimes we lost sight of.
Absolutely. It's funny that one of the same moment in my day, I was spending a lot of time on Zoom, is going for a walk and these big long walks, and I was listening to Translations today. It's such a phenomenal play. Anyway, our next question is from Stephen Flood, who joins us from the Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine at University College Cork. And again, maybe one for Catherine, but others should feel free to join in. His question is, the Glasgow UN Climate Summit has been rescheduled to October 2021. This gives countries time to work out their responses to COVID-19, hopefully shifting to low carbon economy rather than propping up the fossil fuel industry. I'm sure fossil fuel companies will be banging the drum that they will need billions in support to kickstart the global economy post-COVID-19. Will the voices from the renewable sector, from scientists and the environmentalists with climate change activists be louder and more compelling? So it's quite a long question. Catherine, why don't we start with you, and then anybody else who'd like to answer, please just signal to me, please.
Absolutely. Well, I would say, Stephen, that it is not the future. It is already happening. You can look at the US kind of as the tip of the iceberg for fossil fuel involvement in politics. And when you look at the headlines here, you see that environmental protections have been rolled back, fuel economy standards have been rolled back, large bailouts are focusing on big industry. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this pattern around the world, because when you go to Wikipedia, and you click on the richest companies in the world, just look for a list of the richest companies in the world. At the top, we have Walmart, they're number one, but they plan to be 50% clean energy by 2025. At number 11, we have Apple, which is already 100% clean energy, and they are decarbonizing their supply chain. And then in between Walmart and Apple, we have oil and gas, electricity, automotive, oil and gas, companies that made all of their wealth through digging up, processing, selling, or making things that burn fossil fuels. So when you ask, will our voices be louder? We'll certainly try, but our voices have very little money behind them compared to the money that's behind the fossil fuel industry. And so that's why, in my mind, when we look at the recovery and the response to the pandemic long term, the most urgent, the most critical, the most essential question is this: will we, in our response, use this as an opportunity, as has been done previously with the Marshall Plan, with the New Deal in the United States in the 1930s? Will we use this as an opportunity to advance ourselves forward into the future? Or will this recovery, will stimulus packages be instead used to shore up the past?
I don't know, Dara, Jane, Michael, do you want to say anything, or I've got a lot, or we can move on here.
Yeah.
Please, Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on that point about that Catherine just made there, is that these oil and gas and other companies have money and therefore political power, and so very much influence what's going on. And I think this is an opportunity for us to start to to think about what think about value and money in separate ways. And so there's a lot of environmentalists who don't like the idea of talking about monetizing the things that we get from nature, because we should value nature because of its inherent value. But one way that we can make our voices stronger is by shining a light and illuminating the value of nature to every industry, not just the oil and gas industries that are digging up, burning and selling fossil fuels. But if we can start to shine a light on the unrecognized values of nature, then we could have a new economy and have stronger voices. And that's something that we've really been promoting through the whole natural capital debate and through the Irish Forum on Natural Capital. And I know it's been controversial, and I know lots of people don't like the idea of monetizing nature, but it's not all about monetizing. It's about shining a light and showing the value of nature, so that we have got those voices, so that we have got that power to rebuild an economy in a different way.
Thank you very much. Dara, I'm going to come to you, if I may, with the next two questions, because they're a little bit similar. So the first is from Toby, who just says he's in the United States. I'm not entirely sure where Toby is in the US. His question is, will the impact of the pandemic exacerbate the precarious lives of migrant workers for agriculture even more in the future? So that's the first question. The second question is from Michelle Hallahan. Her question is, seems like it would make so much sense to generate local and national markets for Irish food and products rather than relying, as we have been, on globalization. Is this possible in the near future in Ireland? So Dara, I don't know if you'd be willing to take a crack at those two, and then again, let the others join in, please.
Yeah, well, I'll take the second one first, which is an old chestnut, which is why are Irish farmers pumping out milk and beef and shipping it all over the world? Well, the simple answer is because we have a natural competitive advantage in that regard. We can grow grass for fun. We can't grow rice. We can't grow maize, corn, the way they do in the US. We can't grow oranges. Our speciality is dairy and beef. And there isn't a huge range of stuff that we can compete globally. I mean, I've been this soldier, right? I mean, I've tried growing lilies, sunflowers, gladiola, onions, you name it, I've pretty much given it a go. And onions is a classic example. Onions will grow no problem in an Irish climate, but we can't grow them and get that beautiful brown, stain-free skin on an onion here that they can get for fun, basically, in dry climates like Spain, Italy, and Argentina. So the onion is a classic example of a crop that we can produce here, but we can't compete. We can't compete with cheaper imports. And we live in a globalized world. Are we going to become less globalized after COVID or because of COVID-19? I don't think so. I do not think so. I mean, if anything, the whole crisis at the moment has proved how resilient the food chains have been. The shelves have not thinned out. People went out and panicked bought with a vengeance, and still the shelves were replenished, and there's been no shortage of food for the vast majority out there. So I think that, I think it's wishful thinking to think that we can kind of back our way out of a globalized world where, you know, Irish farmers would be effectively protected so that I could indulge my passion in growing onions and not be worried about cheaper imports undercutting me. So that's the reason that the Irish agriculture sector is so specialized. It's the reason that agriculture sectors all over the world are so specialized. And it's about the money, you know, it's about the costs. So, you know, while it's nice to think of, you know, we revert back to nice little cottage farms and they do a little bit of this and there's a few geese and it's a few pigs and there's a few sheep and there's a bit of this and a bit of that. And everyone has a little garden out the back and they're bringing their carrots down to the local farmer's market. It's not a realistic scenario, I don't think, anytime in the near future. The other question was about globalized staff. And again,
migrant workers.
I think that you know, migrant workers are some of the most vulnerable workers in any economy. And it doesn't, whether it's Ireland, America, anywhere else, India, they tend to be the bottom of the economic heap on minimum wages with minimal supports. And so I think this whole pandemic will create hardship for and so the poorest in society will suffer most. I think that here in Ireland, migrant workers, well, it's kind of the guys who were here already have no shortage of work ahead of them, and the guys that were planning to get here are stuck where they are, and they will be basically queuing up to get on the next plane or flight that will allow them to come and work in Ireland or the UK or wherever they normally worked. But I think that, you know, the ability for workers to travel around the world is a huge source of a huge mechanism of transferring wealth around the world to some of the poorest in society, and they're suffering right now.
Absolutely. Can I ask any of other panelists to come in on any of this? If you'd like to, please do. Please, Michael.
Yeah, just briefly, really, Jane. I think to some extent the problem is putting this or presenting this debate in either or terms. In other words, either we have kind of the globalized systems of food production that we have at present, or it's a kind of a radical utopian vision of the small cottage, you know, with the vegetable plot and so on. You know, I think that there is a halfway house here, because I think one of the things about Irish agriculture, if you look at it historically, that really the kind of the shift towards kind of large scale pastoral farming, something that comes after the end of the continental blockade in the 1815, when it was cheaper to kind of import grains from continental Europe than to have them produced in Britain and Ireland. So this led to a very decisive shift towards pastoral farming. And that is, you know, something that has endured, you know, after the land transfers and so on. It mainly went to pastoral farmers rather than tillage farmers and so on. But it seems to me that it's quite possible to think about, and this is where you need things like proper training, government supports and so on, a diversified form of agriculture and food production, where, you know, particular kinds of tillage farming which have existed historically on the island can prevail. Because one of the things that is quite, I mean, it's certainly true that there is, you know, Ricardo's notion of the law of comparative advantage, that countries tend to specialize in those things that they are well able to produce. But having said that, and within that context, one of the things that you find in comparing an awful lot of national agricultures across Europe is that there is a degree of diversification in other food markets that doesn't necessarily obtain in the Irish food market, even within if you like, the kinds of crops that it's possible for that agricultural system to produce. So I think to some extent, presenting it as a strict either or may not be the best way to think about, you know, sustainable practices of the future.
Jane, thank you, Michael. Please, Jane, you're muted. Oh. Francesca, can you unmute Jane?
Yes, sorry, I've unmuted. Great, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to come in on a couple of points. There is one in terms of diversification, and we talk about in the natural world, diversity gives us resilience. I think diversity in farming systems can also provide some resilience as well. And the second thing to pick up on there is in terms of cheaper food being imported from elsewhere. And the reason that it's considered cheaper is because of the way that we value things at the moment. So that isn't taking into account any of the impacts that are happening elsewhere in terms of negative impacts of the way that food is produced on the environment or on society, and the cost of transporting that food. We're not necessarily paying all of those costs, which is why that food appears cheaper. And this is why, I keep saying that we need to sort out our value system and the way that we think about our economy, so that we're actually valuing things properly. And then that might change the situation of being, food being imported from the other side of the planet. I mean, how can that possibly be better than food that's grown locally?
Thank you, Jane. Catherine? No?
I think this actually relates to the question that Paul had, if you don't mind me going there. Paul identifies as a concerned citizen and said, well, how do we redirect the recovery from how do we return to what we're doing before to how can we reorient our economy away from this? And what Jane pointed out is very key. We are not paying the real price for things. Yeah. So we're not paying the real price for our food. We are definitely not paying the right price for our energy. Fossil fuels are subsidized to the tune of 6% of the world's GDP. In the United States, according to the International Monetary Fund, the indirect and direct subsidies, when you put them together, to fossil fuels in the US exceed $600 billion a year, which is more than the Pentagon's budget. But Paul's question also goes on to reflect a key misconception that we have. And he says, we know now that we can stop flying, driving cars, and shopping as a hobby, and we can make our own meals and our own entertainment. And I completely agree with that. And I think this is really a wonderful reminder to all of us as to what is really important in life, what matters, what our priorities are. But here's the sad thing. If we look at the biggest reason why our carbon emissions have temporarily dropped, why our air quality has temporarily improved, it is industry. It's not personal choices. It is industrial production. And if you look at every individual in the world, even if we as individuals did everything we could to cut our carbon footprint, to live within our personal boundaries, that in and of itself as individuals would not be sufficient to fix either the ecological crises or the climate crises. And that's why we need system-wide change. In fact, I learned something recently that did not surprise me, but it horrified me. And that is the fact that although the concept of a personal carbon footprint was created by people who care about ecology and the environment, it was actually popularized a number of decades ago by a very well-funded and expensive ad campaign by British Petroleum. The idea that we as individuals are somehow the culprits. It's the farmers who are doing this, as Dara said. It's those people who do this, those people who do that. We find it convenient to point the fingers when in reality, 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. We need system-wide change. And because of that, I truly believe that one of the most important things that each of us as individuals can do, no matter who we are, is what we're doing right now. And that is talking about it, understanding the risks, the choices, and the impacts, as well as the solutions, and then advocating for change at every level. Because only by doing so will we actually see the long-term change that we need.
Thank you, Catherine. And it brings me to 3 questions that are very similar, but I want to read them out. So the first is from Tom Nelson, who describes himself as an interested citizen, anxious to survive, but more importantly for my grandchildren to survive and thrive. His question is, to what extent are policymakers and political leaders contemplating the changes needed as suggested by your panel? So in other words, the policymakers, are they actually really thinking about the changes? Then there are 2 other questions I'd like to ask you. One from Marcus Beresford. Do the panelists think it is realistic that policymakers will prioritize nature climate change without it being commodified? And then Lorna Hutchin has another related question. Climate strikes and marches illustrate there is public will to change. Academics point to the science that backs them, but government policies would be seen as unpopular. How can the gap be bridged? So again, it's the translating of all of this into policies that make a difference. Again, I don't know who would like, I'd love to hear from everybody on this one. If you've got anything to say at all, it would be, I think, very, very helpful. Who'd like to start? Dara, do you want to start?
Sure. I think, yeah, I mean, it's already been touched on by other members of the panel here, the fact that biodiversity is key, and it is a key way of making our society and our environments and our systems more sustainable. And I think that I'll just use one example to maybe illustrate that, we don't actually need to entirely break down the current system, and we can still make improvements. So, for example, on the farm here, we have a dairy herd, and just in the last 2 years, we started planting multi-species swards. So the biggest crop in Ireland is grass, and the vast majority of it is a monoculture made up of perennial ryegrass. And perennial ryegrass is great for farmers because it just chucks out tons of grass in response to one thing: nitrogen. So it's a really easy thing to manage. You sow the seed, you apply nitrogen, and it just generates a lot of feed for ruminants. But it's entirely dependent on chemical nitrogen. And it's funny, Irish farmers turned their back on older systems because this new system using perennial ryegrass and nitrogen was easy, and it was cheap, and it was profitable. But now that we know what we know, i.e. that, chucking out nitrogen like it's gone out of fashion isn't necessarily a good thing. In fact, it's most definitely a bad thing. We now know that it's worth our while putting in the extra effort to encourage things like clover, which fixes nitrogen into the ground in our swards. So here at home, not only have we included clover, but we've included a 6-way mix of chicory, plantain, yarrow, other types of grasses. And what we're seeing is a whole series of benefits. So number one, it reduces the nitrogen requirement on the crop. Number two, it makes it more drought resilient because you've got plants that react differently in drought situations. They've got a deeper rooting profile in the ground, so they're sucking moisture and minerals from a wider profile in the ground. And because they're taking minerals out of a wider profile in the ground, it's actually more nutritious for the animals. And you're kind of going, hang on a second, did farmers not know about this 20 years ago? What the hell? Why has it taken until now for progressive farmers, commercial farmers to wire into this? And the fact is that it was felt, I come back to that point, that it was easier just to put in perennial ryegrass and stick on nitrogen. And it was, but it has these hidden costs that the other speakers have referred to. And those hidden costs are becoming more transparent. So I just use that as one example of how Irish agriculture may not need to turn its back on ruminants in order to become a more carbon neutral type system and still be able to play to its trump cards. A lot of the speakers have talked about, we still need more diversity within Irish agriculture. I think there will be still, we still have grain farmers, even though I've talked all about ruminant farming, we still have a lot of grain produced in this country. And I think, with greater awareness about the impact of cutting down rainforests in South America to grow soya, to produce protein that we then lorry into animals on the other side of the planet, as that awareness in the public grows, then farmers like me are now experimenting with growing protein crops on the home farm to feed turkeys or poultry or ruminants or whatever else. So farmers are experimenting. It doesn't happen overnight. This isn't a switch and there is no silver bullet, and it's not just going to happen. And bear in mind, it is effectively only in the very short, recent times that farmers have been basically informed lads, you know what you're doing? This is having serious consequences. It's taken a few years for all that to percolate in, but it's also taken a few years for the research to catch up and come up with alternatives. And farmers are more than willing to put their arms around alternatives.
Actually, on that note, again, Jane, Catherine, Michael, do you want to come in here as well?
Yeah, I just want to make a point really about the power of stories. I mean, one thing that strikes me in terms of political change, and you know, and Dara's making a point earlier about how, despite all the things that Donald Trump does and says about that his ratings still remain very, very high. But one of the reasons that they remain high is that Trump is a genius for telling simple stories that seem to make sense, even if they're contradicted by all kinds of scientific evidence. It doesn't really matter, because the force of the story is such, the rhetorical hold of the stories is so strong. And I think maybe one of the weaknesses of the environmental movement has been a very great concern, despite what its opponents say, with evidence, with producing evidence-based arguments, with showing that particular arguments before about fossil fuels industry are completely fallacious. But one of the consequences of that, it seems to me, is that we haven't concentrated enough on the power of counter myth, on the power of counter story. Because one thing, for example, that struck me about the bushfires in Australia was these terrible, terrible things were happening, you know, just hundreds of thousands of hectares of bush were being destroyed. But it's when the koala bears come center stage that all of a sudden you get this kind of global resonance. So anytime there's a kind of vulnerable fauna, and particularly, you know, it helps if they're kind of, they're cute, cuddly, etc. That this kind of mobilizes global attention. But what I think that indicates, however, is the power of image, the power of story. And this is, you know, this is old as political establishments themselves, is the power of rhetoric. And the people who are hell-bent on destroying the planet are supremely good at using particular forms of rhetoric, whether it's the high-end rhetoric that's paid for by British Petroleum, or the kind of low-end populist rhetoric that's employed by the Brazilian and US leaders. So it seems to me that we need to go back and kind of school ourselves in the rhetorical arts of the ancients as one way of dealing with the current crisis.
Well, I was going to say, you can tell you're a humanist, Michael. It's so but you're absolutely so right. I love it. Catherine, and then Jane.
Well, I was going to say the same thing too.
There you go.
this shows us exactly why we need everyone when it comes to this issue, because stories are what actually motivate us to change. That is why we need people who understand words, who understand stories, who understand the myths that run through our culture that we respond to, sometimes consciously, sometimes just subconsciously or instinctively. If anybody's interested in learning more about the specific stories that are and have been told, and the people who are crafting these stories when it comes to climate change, there's a wonderful resource called Merchants of Doubt. In other words, people who deal in doubt. It is a very compelling documentary. It is an excellent book, and it unpacks these stories. It sort of draws aside the curtain and shows us what's behind it. And Michael is absolutely right. It is nothing to do with physical science. It is nothing to do with natural or life sciences. It has everything to do with our psychology, our stories, what makes us human, our culture. That's what motivates us to act or keeps us from acting.
Equally important. Thank you, Jane.
And yeah, just to build on that, I think, you know, once we get the stories and the will amongst people, then that's when it brings the political change. And I think one of the, going back to the original questions was, you know, how will you know, the public is willing to change, how you know, how will government policy respond? And I think one of the problems has been that government policy has been very siloed. And you know, the different departments are responsible for little different bits of legislation. It doesn't always join up. It doesn't always, you know, sometimes it contradicts each other. And this issue of climate change, biodiversity loss, of the importance of nature to people has become lost through a series of different government agencies and departments, whereas it needs to be front and center to everything that we're doing at a policy level. And I think that's getting people on board helps to bring that to the front and center of the policymakers.
Are you hopeful, Jane, that our government is listening? I'm going to ask you the same question, Catherine, from a North American perspective.
I hope so. I think, we've seen over the last 12 months a huge increase in, as one of the people who asked a question there, sorry, I can't remember who it was, said, the climate strikes, the public global assessment last year, huge increase in people's awareness and understanding about biodiversity loss, and more about the climate crisis. So I think people are much more aware. We've seen increases in support for green politics. I'm hoping our leaders are listening.
Yeah, obviously we all are. What about you, Catherine? How hopeful are you on the other side of the pond?
I certainly look for hope. I feel like hope is not going to find us. We have to go out and look for it. And when we do go out and look for it, we do find hope. So for example, in my home country of Canada, we had an election this past October, and it was really a referendum on carbon pricing. We have had 4 provinces that had a price on carbon for a number of years. The Liberal Party, who was in power, had introduced a new price on carbon, and then there was an election. They won the election, which means there is overwhelming support for positive climate action across the country, despite the fact that a large amount of our economy in Canada depends on the oil and gas industry. Now, in the United States, again, the headlines are all about Trump and the oil and gas companies. But when you look below the federal government headlines, there is hope here too. So just as an example, there's a movement called We Are Still In, which refers to the Paris Agreement. The number of states, cities, businesses, organizations, universities, tribal nations that have signed on to the We Are Still In agreement amount to nearly 50% of the United States emissions. When we look at how cities and states and businesses, from Microsoft to Apple to cities right here in Texas where I live, are preparing for a changing climate, there is hope. Our Dallas is already carbon neutral. They have the first carbon neutral airport in North America. Houston is implementing a climate action plan that was delayed by the pandemic. It was supposed to be released 2 weeks ago, but it will now be released in April. There is hope. We just have to go out and look for it. And when we find it, we have to share it. Because without hope, we will be a self-fulfilling prophecy of despair.
In a way, I'd love to end on that note because it's such a positive one. But as is our practice when we wrap these conversations up, I do go back to each panelist and say, if you have one message you would like our audience to go home with tonight, obviously they're in their own homes, but as they switch off and go out and look at the full moon, what is that one message you want them to take away? And we don't have very much time. I'm going to start with you, Dara. I will do it in reverse order this time. One key message for our audience tonight, what would it be?
Jeepers, okay, no pressure. I suppose it would be that keep the faith a little bit, because I think that the society and industry, whether it's agriculture or otherwise, is aware the message is getting through on the impact that it or we are having. And, if anything, I think one of the most arresting images from the COVID-19 crisis are those satellite images which show, the change in the emissions between before and after. And it's like, when those images first emerged of planet Earth from outer space, it was a very arresting image. It was one that really was seared in the minds and the cultural psyche of people. And I think that image was on every newspaper worth its salt.
I'm going to stop you, Dara, just because we're out of time. So
sorry.
So you could hope, keep the faith. Jane, very quickly, what would you be?
Quickly, nature keeps us healthy. We're part of nature, so we need to value and protect nature.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Michael?
My message would be take your thinking outdoors. Don't think indoors all the time. It's strange advice in COVID times, but go outdoors, go out your backyard, and just count up all the non-human organisms in that backyard, that back garden, and think about how you relate to it.
Thank you. Last but not least, Catherine.
To care about issues like biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction, deforestation, and climate change, we often think that we have to be a certain type of person, somebody who is already an environmentalist, somebody who already lives in an environmentally friendly way. But what this pandemic has brought home is that we are all part of this interconnected system. And to care about biodiversity, to care about the integrity of our ecosystems, to care about our planetary boundaries and the limits on the resources we can use, and last but not least, to care about climate change, the great threat multiplier, we only have to be one thing. And that one thing is a human living on planet Earth, and every single one of us is that one thing.
Well, again, just such, I mean, the insights we've had tonight, and I'm so sorry, there are many other questions. You can see them coming up on the screen. Before we thank everybody, though, I do want to make a few announcements. First thing is our next Behind the Headlines will take place on the topic democracy in a time of pandemic, because lots of very scary things are happening with our democracy, not just here in Ireland, but around the world. And obviously we'll put the details on our website. Please sign up to our weekly newsletter if you're not already receiving it, because it'll also give you access to our weekly blog, humanities and other reflections on the coronavirus pandemic. This week, our public policy fellow, Rory Montgomery, discusses the EU and the pandemic, but there's been a whole series of wonderful blogs there, but Rory's is just an absolute cracker. I'd like to invite you all to join me on Thursday, the 9th of April at 1:15 for a conversation with the artist Rita Duffy. Again, she is just a phenomena, and the work that Rita has been producing in this moment of crisis is really just tremendous. And she'll talk about art and creativity and crisis. So please, that's 1:15 on the 9th. We'll put the link up through our website. We podcast all of these conversations. So the podcast from tonight's Behind the Headlines will be available, and you can listen back to the Plagues and Pandemics one from nearly a fortnight ago. So without further ado, I'm going to thank my amazing team, Aoife, Francesca, Katrina, Giovanna, everybody in the Trinity Long Room Hub who makes these events run so smoothly. I want to thank you, our audience. It's not the same as being in the room together, but actually there is a tremendous energy as well. So thank you for joining us this evening. And literally the night has fallen, as you can see in the background here. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. But above all, I want to thank our speakers. I mean, you guys have just been phenomenal, and you have made this just the most inspiring conversation. It's all about conversation. It's all about storytelling. And the more of this we can do, so much the better. So on everybody's behalf, I'd like to give you a huge round of applause. So well done, everybody. So good night and take care, everyone. Bye.